Okay, here we go. Second installation for the PowerApps platform. I was going to say the first, but the first one was the intro. But this is where the rubber really meets the road. Now, what we're going to do is start building out our inventory list and our custom form for PowerApps for the inventory list. But we're also going to talk about the 5 best practices when building custom forms in PowerApps. If you're like me, you play around with this stuff long enough that you notice that if you had to do it all over again, you would do it different, and these are the 5 things you should look at. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about the 5 best practices for building the custom form using PowerApps as of August 2019. And I say as of August 2019, that's like my disclaimer, right? Because we know that Microsoft is forever adding new features, new capabilities. And I think us as consultants or app makers, we really start to test these tools out, and we learn and start to formulate our best practices based on creating more of these forms over time. And it's also, either pushing them in production, but more importantly, having these go through a maintenance cycle. And it's through the maintenance cycles that I think if you roll back the test of time and look at, the solution or the architect or the design phase of the form, that's when you really start to tweak things and fine-tune things to come up with something that's scalable and maintainable over time. So in short, the apps, the way that we develop custom forms or even apps using PowerApps 24 months ago would be a much different approach 24 months later, right? And that's just because, again, new capabilities, new features. PowerApps looks a lot different than what it did when it first GA'd, and as well as, going through those maintenance cycles and some of the lessons learned. All right, so let's go through number one. Number one, from my experience, is to start off with a wireframe. So if I pop over here into Teams, I think it's so easy to get caught up to just jump into PowerApps and start putting things together based on the requirements or based on what you know. And sometimes it just makes sense to just take a step back, spend the extra 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever, via a wireframe and see exactly what you're building, and then run that past the business users and do a lot of your adjusting and tweaking here versus multiple tabs later or formulas later and changing display names later and making these breaking changes, and you find yourself that you make this one small change, but because of the ripple effect it becomes a 20-step change, even though from a customer's eyes it seems very small. So try to vet as much. Of course you're not going to get perfect, but try to vet as much as you can via a wireframe. So if you're looking at this here, this is going to be our inventory form. And again, just to kind of take you back to the previous video, we're starting with this equipment request list and really equipment request process. And really what we have are 2 main lists. We have the inventory list, meaning that if you're going to submit a request and say, yep, I need a laptop, I need a mouse, I need a dual monitor, I need a docking station, yada, 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 you have like this control list or finite list of equipment to pull from. So that's going to be our inventory list. The other list is the one that's going to actually have the details of the request. So here is Deshaun Clark. He needed he selected a laptop. He selected this and this and this. But then this is his manager that needs to approve it and all this other good stuff. So that's going to be on the request side of the house. We're focused on the inventory side. So with the inventory side, we came up through, from wireframing and really just kind of brainstorming and spitballing a lot of this stuff out. We have the details tab, which has like the details of the actual item, right? And this is looking from in the view of a inventory manager or equipment manager perspective, not necessarily from an end user who's requesting. So they won't actually see this form. They'll see the results of the items generated through this form. So here you got the product name, and then what's the category of the item, what's the company's cost versus the manufacturer retail cost, a brief description of the item. A lot of this stuff is what we're inputting in, so the requester can kind of get a sense of what they're actually getting. And then this status is going to be the status of the item, and again, from the perspective of inventory. Is it active? That's the publish flag. what was the date that this item was approved, and who approved it, what's the lease time. And this is something we kind of toying around with that says, okay, we're leasing all this equipment from Apple. So we got MacBook Pros, we got iPad Pros, XYZ. But from an end user perspective, they minimum need to hold on to it for 24 months or whatever that may be. And the max time is that after 36 months, we want to refresh it because that's our agreement with Apple. On hand, again, this is just inventory count, how many you have on hand versus on order. And then here, this Photos tab, this is where you're going to get multiple photo angles of the equipment. So maybe a front view, a side view, view of the ports, and, you know, stuff that you see on Amazon 24/7, right? And then for the photos piece here, because we're working with a designer that knows a little bit about PowerApps or some of the gotchas, we realize that this is going to be the view phase of the form, or the view mode of the form, and this is going to be the edit or new mode of the form when dealing with photos, right? Because if you're displaying a photo like this will allow you to change the URLs to the photo, images, and all this other good stuff. And then we have this note section. So note section is most of these processes, right? You know, if you're like me, you know, time and time again, you hear this option of you need an audit of what's going on, like who created it, you know, when was it approved, if there are any notes about this item or about this request, whatever. That's the note section. And what we want to try to do for this note section is really kind of get into how to leverage collections and JSON objects versus another additional list to kind of store this, which is the technique one that I used prior, but it could be a little bit overkill, could have a much larger SharePoint footprint, meaning that you have a list for comments, you have a list for this, you have a list for that, you know, so maybe we can just store this as JSON, and we can talk about the pros and cons with that approach. So again, I would say the best practice number one from what I've learned, if you can hash out a lot of going from soup to nuts and from a requirements listing or backlog of list of items to an actual wireframe, that really starts to get the conversation going, and you can get a lot of your moves and adjustments done at this phase of the process versus through the actual implementation of the Power App itself. All right, so that's one. The other one, and this is just working with, and this fits well within our new Power Platform series, because once you look at all these different technologies and how it affects the overall process, Power Apps is going to be your data gathering piece. Flow is going to be your process management piece, right? Your approval, your workflow, even sometimes your batch process on the schedule. That's going to be your flow. And then your Power BI is going to be your analytics piece, meaning that how is it performing, where are the KPIs, where are some of the key charting or key indicators that you want to highlight. But when it comes to your SharePoint list, and understanding that that's just one possible data source out of many when you start speaking of the Power Platform, naming your columns in your SharePoint list becomes, I think, this best practice number two. Here you want to make sure that there's a difference, or you understand the difference between the internal name and the display name, and keeping your internal names formula friendly and your display name user friendly. And what do I mean by that? Formula friendly in the sense that when you get to the flow, or in some cases when you start to create formulas within the Power App itself, you have to reference these column names. Like if you want to do a null check, or a greater than less than check, or a date value check, or format dates, and all this other good stuff. So you referencing these columns or these data elements are by internal name. In some cases it's display name. But I know in Flow, especially when you start building expressions, it's just much easier and actually are less prone to mistakes if you're using internal names without special characters, without spaces, and you know, just those things that make them formula friendly. And that's just one of the things. Like if I had to roll back the test of time and say, man, I really wish I didn't put these parentheses with this slash to represent this column name, because now when I get into the formula, sometimes those special characters I run into problems, or I have to single quote a lot of things, or you know, just so on and so forth. So internal names versus display names when you're building your site columns, and this just really just keep things nice and clean and nice and tidy. And what I have here is for my inventory list, I have all the internal names and the display names and the column types, and really just kind of spending that time to kind of think through what you want to build, how you want to build it, what's the naming convention you want to go after, and really what's the column type. And sometimes these column types will help or really kind of dictate the formulas as well, because if you use something that's over the top, more complex than really needs to be, then you kind of run into those issues as well. So that's I think the main thing for step number 2 is just to make sure that you have internal name. You're treating your internal names separate from your display names, and make sure that your internal names are formula friendly, meaning no special characters, no spacing, and then use your display name to really kind of decorate it to do what you need it to do. All right. So here's the other thing. So best practice number 3. Best practice number 3, and this is probably one of those things that if you don't do this initially, it becomes very tedious, again, especially with the flow. And there's some scenarios with the PowerApps, it just adds that much overhead to your app building process, and that's setting the required flag for your columns on your list. The recommendation is not to set the required flag on any of your site columns at the list level. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be required. You're just not setting it at the list level, and instead you're flipping the required flag on the PowerApp data card itself within PowerApps. Again, and from what I've seen, if you set it here, it boxes you in. One, the update process, the update action and flow, you're required to fill in a lot more items. And if you're doing very simple things like, okay, every time this flow runs, I need to update the status. I mean, now that single step right there becomes a 20 or 30 step process, depending on how many of these required flags that you have on your site columns, because each one of these must have a value even in that update process. So in another scenario, from a PowerApps perspective, you may have a scenario where you have the user come in and fill out part of the process, save it, come back, fill out the rest of the process, save it, come back. So you have this save and enter, save and enter, and then a submit, versus them having all the information up front and then clicking submit before a process. And if you set flags on the SharePoint list item at the list level, then that boxes you in, and you're unable to do some of those fancy, cool save and gather type information, which in some scenarios are critical for business processes for very long forms. All right. So enough of that. So that was going to be step 1 and 2 and 3. Let's talk about step 4. Step 4 was when it comes to customizing your form, and this is the again on the inventory list. When it comes to customizing this form, I would say keep it simple. Keep your design simple, right? So as you can see, this is being pulled from a site with Tesla branding, right? And from here, of course, if this is your organization, you want to, have your logo up there. You want to have, in some scenarios, your company color or your branded color or whatever the case may be, part of your form. What you do not want to do, and this could be a usability issue as well as a very tedious to your design of the form, is that you don't want to come in here and start customizing like background colors and things along those lines within each element, especially in the data card. So, if what I normally do is that I would just come in here in this form. You saw this in previous videos. Just come in here, drop in a rectangle, right, with a color that is going to have my branded color on there. I would drop in the logo and then pretty much call it done, right? I'm not trying to come through here and for each one of these labels have the Tesla red or even come in here and change the sizes, right? Because any change that you make to these data cards, anytime that you touch this data card or you have to remove it and re-add it, or any of the weird things that you just come through just with the cycle of dealing with PowerApps, you're going to have to replicate those colors, and those are just time killers. And most of the time, from an end user perspective, they're not paying a lot of attention to that type of like, oh, is this the right color, or why is this, the labels for each one of my form fields black? I wish they were the Tesla red or the Tesla black gray or whatever the case may be. So keep those simple. If you want to, if you have to, if your hand is kind of forced to where you have to add some design to it, just because you're working with a UI designer that's keeping things crazy, try to baseline your colors with some of the out-of-the-box themes. Honestly, I think anything outside of a white background is just distracting. Of course, you know, you have full control of that color palette, but again, why mess with that piece? You'll come off better. You'll come off better just modifying like the edges, right? Like maybe a rectangle at the top and maybe your action buttons that you put at the bottom and what have you. You may come out better customizing those, but not your controls that you use to actually build your form. I think that's just it just adds more overhead than what it's really worth. So what I'm gonna do, let me pause this video, go ahead and add in this header in the logo, just kind of get this baseline, what I mean as far as the basic color or schema. Okay, so this is what I came up with. I mean, very simple. You just have a nice little rectangle here at the top. You want that to be stretched across from left and right. I got a simple header here that's a 0.16 default font size or font name. I'm not modifying the font name, and probably put a semi-bold so it pops, and with the logo. And really that's it. So I keep things elegant, keep things small. You know, if I'm looking at branding this, you know, very light branding, I'm going to just drop in the branded color and the logo. And this is the Tesla red. So when I bring in this logo, what I do, I go to this site. If you do a Google search on online image color picker, this imagecolorpicker.com will come up. You just upload the image. You hit this this cursor here, just to kind of give you the hex number. Once you have the hex number, you just go back in here on your rectangle where the background color, where you want to modify that, go into custom, and then paste in that hex number, and you're ready to rock and roll. And it's a pixel perfect match, right? So really that's it from a branding perspective. I'm not coming through here and touching each one of these data cards, making those modifications, because I'm setting myself up for failure by adding all that additional overhead. The next thing we want to do is just make sure there's no scroll bars, right? So this is going to be a fairly large form. So if I bring up my, let me close this inventory schema list out and then kind of go back to my wireframe. If I bring up this wireframe, one, I have to put the tabs on here, but I mean, look at all these fields that I have to account for. So we're going to have to break that up, and that's number 5. So really best practice number 5, which I think is probably the most important takeaway here, is that for very large forms, there's a couple of patterns that you want to follow. One, in forms in general, you want to keep the number of controls or field elements that you have on a row, you want those to be at 1, and in very rare cases you want to double up. So here I have price, where the cost and all this stuff is related. So, and usually like for date fields where you have, if you separate the month, the year, and or maybe you have month and time, there's a separate control for the time piece of it. But those pieces right there, you want to, it's okay to put those on multiple lines, but on the same row. But from a usability standpoint, and you can do the research and you can talk to any UI UX, for large forms you want to try to minimize the number of controls on the row to 1. You want to maximize to 1, and if you have to go beyond that, there's a clear relationship between the different data columns. Like I said, like even for date, if it's month, day, and year, that would be 3 controls. But we know we got the date picker and all the other stuff, so we can get around with it with 1. But if you're doing date and time, it makes sense to keep those on a single row. Or any other related data to the process or the form elements, you want to keep those to the single row. So because this is a large form, what I want to do is break this up into multiple form controls. Now this is a new pattern, and from this new pattern, this is where I've just learned over the past few months that trying to do this. So let me talk about the old pattern versus the new. In the old pattern, what I would do, I would add in all the controls that are needed for this form into this single SharePoint form control. So it'll be all of the data cards or all the fields that are needed added to here. And then I will create my tabular design, and based on the tab button, I will hide or show those data cards based on what I wanted to display on there. And for the initial setup, that was fine. The problem I ran into is that when you had this form with all those data cards that were dynamically hiding and showing each other, and if you go into edit fields, and what I would do, like say for example, these top 4, and they'll never be in order, right? So these top 4 are like 1, 2, 5, 7, and 12 was on the first tab. When you go to rearrange those, in some cases, you'll run into scenarios where it actually just wouldn't move, which was a pain in the butt. You had to refresh and get out of the studio, come back into studio, and then play around that way. In other scenarios, you would change the order and get this looking perfect, like exactly like the right order. Go to the next tab and realize that arranging the first tab rearranged or messed up the ordering on the second tab. And then you get that one together, then with this deorganize the first tab and the third tab, and you just find yourself in this constant battle. And I promise you, the amount of time that you spend trying to get that stuff together, you probably could have built that form 3 or 4 times over already. So one of the patterns that I found was to use multiple form controls, and that's not intuitive because you can't submit, or on the save event, you can't save multiple form controls. So if you go to the SharePoint integration, right, and then on save, you see that this submit option is only submitting 1. Of course, you can do semicolon and have multiple submits, but then it's this race condition, right? Because you would have name and description on form 1, and then you may have price and retail price on form 2. But then once you say form 1, and of course they do them in sequence, on form 2, it's just like you didn't specify a name or description, so I assume those are blank. So it erases what's in form 1. So you can't submit, but there's a way to do it. So first thing we want to do is just break this up into multiple forms. So let me go ahead and add in my buttons for tabs. Let me get the first form decorated on how it should look, and then we'll layer in the second form together. 1 second. Okay, so all I have here is I have 4 buttons, and I have them labeled as what you see here in the wireframe: detail, status, photos, and notes. And now what I'm going to do is just go ahead to this form control, scooch this up, and that's the technical term, scooch. And just enough to where I'm cutting off enough of the top just so they can kind of look like they're tabs. And it's kind of hard for me to see that because a couple of things. One, these photos, oh man, these buttons should be sent to back. So let me order these and send them to back. And then this form needs to have a solid white background. By default, it's transparent. So if you put that solid white on there, they kind of look like tabs now. I probably can do a better job if I squeeze in a little bit, take a closer look at what I'm doing, and then use my arrow key just to kind of give me enough real estate. That's and you can sit here and tinker with this all day, right? So all right, let's just call that done. All right, and then these still don't kind of look like tabs, but I should probably drop down the font size maybe to an even 10, or maybe in the 9, maybe a 9 or so, or something like that. Again, you can keep playing around with this until your heart is content. Now, but this kind of gives you that optical illusion that you're dealing with tabs, right? Even though they are buttons that have the bottoms chopped off. So now what I want to do is I want to capture this fill color here, right? And again, this is a lot of recap on my previous let's just call this inactive. This is a recap on my previous sorry, I'm distracted here, of my previous PowerApp form video. And but I think the big takeaway here is that the biggest takeaway here is that what we accomplished in the previous video, and you can take a look at that if you do probably like a YouTube search on Deshaun PowerApps. You will see the original approach compared to this new approach, and you'll see how they're vastly different. Now I have the buttons here, and now what we want to do is to actually duplicate this form. And I never tried duplicating this form. I always built it from scratch, so I'm not going to try that now where I'm live on video. So all I'm going to do is just go to Insert Form, and you always want to select the Edit Form Control. And then I'm going to rename this to with a prefix of FRM for Form, and then Status, which is the name of my second tab. And I'm going to just go up here and decorate this form similar to some of the key features or property values that I have on my main form. So the data source is going to be the same. And then there's an item property that you want to make the same. So if I go to the item property, all of this set up here, I want to paste that in the item property of that new form here. Right? And that's going to pretty much allow me to modify or adjust the site columns for the selected list item, because understand that you're dealing with a list and it can have hundreds or hundreds of thousands of items, but at any given time when you're dealing with a form, you're only dealing with one, and it's the selected item, as you can kind of see here hinted in the formula. So SharePoint integration, that's the hook that hooks it into the SharePoint list, and then .selected is the selected item. And what this formula is do, it takes into account what if it's a new item, like you hit new, there's no selected item because it's brand new. How does it deal with that scenario? So we're just copying, piggybacking off of all that formula, all that logic, and then just dropping that into our form status. So now if I come in here and do copy and paste, and again, I've never done this before, but I'm comfortable with doing the one that I just created. And now just simply rename this to photos. And for notes, we're not going to do that. So we're going to hold off for notes for now. So now I'm wired up to where I have 3 form controls. I have my original, I have one for status and one for photos. And now what I want to do is toggle between them. So there's a couple of things that I want to do first. I want to get the positioning right. So the X, Y coordinates. So here my X and Y is 0 and 80. So I want to replicate that here. I get the 0 for free. So I just want to drop in the 80. And that's going to position those at right at the bottom of those buttons that I wanted them to be in. The last thing I want to do, again, these come over with a transparent background, so I want to make these a solid background. And as soon as I make it solid, it seems like the SharePoint Form 1 disappeared, but it didn't disappear. It's just behind status and photos because these are all stacked on top of each other. So now what we want to do is leverage these buttons, these on select events, to show and hide and toggle between the actual form controls. This is a very similar pattern what we used in the previous video, in the previous series with PowerApps, but instead of doing that with data cards, we're going to do it with the entire form control on its own. And so if I do this, so if I go to, let me just go ahead and wire these up really quickly. So if I go to this button and hit the on select property, and I'm going to make up a variable. Let's call this variable, I'm going to say set var details to true, right, when that's selected. But we're also going to set var, again, I'm making this variable up, var status to false, right? And let me just copy this and paste it 2 more times. So instead of status, this is going to be photos. And as you can see, I'm just following the naming convention of my tabs. And I'm going to do this for notes. Right? So now what I can do, I can select all of those formulas, go to my next button, and then just paste it in. And when I paste it in, I have to make one or two adjustments. Whereas, okay, now I'm on the status tab, so detail should be false and status should be true. Right? So now I go into photos and it's the same deal. When I go to photos, paste that in, photos should be true and var status should be, oops, detail should be false. This is the paste from the first one. Oops. Come on, don't lock on me. This is the paste from the first one, right? And for notes, even though we're not using the form for notes, we still want the ability to hide the other ones when the notes tab is clicked. So var details is false and we set notes to true. All right, so that's good. So actually that means nothing. We just toggling between the variables and in the global namespace, and now we actually need to use them. So for SharePoint Form 1, this is going to be our main one. And for the visible property, instead of a default hard-coded true, we're going to say var details. So if var details have true inside of it, then that's going to trigger the view for the main one. And we follow the same pattern for status. So if we go to form status, go to visible, whatever, if it's true or false in var status, that will set that visible property. And if it's true false for var photos, that would set that visible property. So var photos, right? And right now we don't have anything for var notes, but it looks like we better do something quick. So for var notes, just for giggles, what we're going to do, let's just go ahead and throw a rectangle in there. And for the life of me, I still don't understand the logic or the reasoning behind putting shapes under the icon menu. And hopefully that changes, because it's not intuitive at all. But then again, once you're used to it, once you created one or two of these, you know exactly where to go get it. But you can definitely bang your head up against the wall to finding it the first time. So here, we're going to just put a general rectangle out here. And on this rectangle, we're going to turn the border off. So there's no border, just a solid white. And we want to make sure the XY coordinates are the same as our form control, which is 80. And for this rectangle, let's rename it. So let's just call this rec bg. Well, let's just do it bg notes. So this is the background control for notes, and the visible property would be var details, or var notes, sorry. Var notes. Oops. All right. So that's that. So now, if I hold down my Alt key and test this, there's my first form, there's my status form, there's my photos form, and there's my notes rectangle. Right? And I just assume those are right because I really don't have a way to validate that. So now what I can do, I can select my form, my photos form, click on the edit fields, hit add, and all the site columns are available on my SharePoint Form 1 are also available here. So this is how I'm segmenting them out. So now when I go to photos, I actually want, for my photos tab, I want fields 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you select them in the order that you want them to appear, once you hit apply, they appear in the order as selected. So if you know what you're doing and you're able to select those right off, then you're golden. So now I hold on my Alt key and hit status, and this is my status form, and I kind of need some help from my wireframe. So if I go down to the status form, I need publish. I'm not going to worry about like this status here and lease time and count, because we know that those can be custom data cards, and we'll throw labels in there and rectangles and all this other good stuff. So I'm not going to worry about those now, but what I want to do is put publish, approved date, and all these other ones in there. And I'm not going to be able to memorize that because my memory is melting on me. So let me just see if I can squeeze these in. Okay, so now if I do add fields on my status, I do publish, hit the X, and then I do approve, just approve date and the approve manager. Again, selecting them in the order I want these to appear. I got min time, I got max time, I have on hand and on order. So if I do on hand, on order, and I gotta scroll down, but I'm scared because if I lose this dialog, everything that I selected gets lost. So I'm gonna just go ahead and hit add here, and again, that's just gonna drop them in. I'm just go ahead and collapse all so that way I can see what's really going on in one shot. And as you can tell, these are in the order that they need to be. So now, and oh, I got lucky. So that's it for status, right? And nice and sweet and short. But you see that status form has this dual column situation going on. So what I want to do is select the form status component, set the dual column here, and that's going to dual column everything out. And I want this to be all the way across, so I set that to a 444, right? And I've seen this, that based on the theme that you select, this date picker can be extremely large, like magnifying glass large. And I'm not sure why that's the case. So if I can come up here and adjust it, so I can do that to a 10 or a 10.5 or whatever it needs to be. But by default, that thing comes in extremely large, and I have no idea why. So here, so now what I can do, I can come in here now, and as you expect, I can adjust these out and get these all on the same column that I need to have them on, and all this other good stuff. Again, just if this was one form control, this would be a nightmare. That simple step of, oh, let me just pop this over to where it appears on the same row as approved date, that would be a nightmare. And if you follow that previous pattern that we had before, you know by experience how tedious and brain racking this can be. So now that I have this format, it's not formatted 100% like how I want it, but it's very darn close. And now I have that separation of the various forms. And the one thing I have to do now is go into my first form and start to remove some stuff, right? Because now I have these edit fields that I've gotten by default just by dealing with this. So if I squeeze this in a little bit, what I have here, product name, category. So now I want to take category, slide it up. It's not here. Do I have pricing here? I have pricing, retail price, that's there. On hand, it's not needed for this view. On orders, not needed for this view. Photo 1 and 2 and 3 are not needed for this view. So what I'm doing is just go ahead and drop these off. I think by default it seems like you get the first 10 as they're defined in that SharePoint list. And here we can fine tune it and get exactly what we need based on our wireframe. So here I'm missing category. So let me just add that. I'm missing, and you would notice that I won't take my cursor and do this, right? And hit backspace. Okay, that works smooth. Normally what I would do, I would overshoot it, and I would lose that pop-up dialog and have like 10 or 11 of those selected, lose that dialog and have to start all over from scratch. So I always find myself hitting the X to clear this search field out. All right, so that's category, cost retail I have, description I have. I think that's it. So let's just go ahead and add this in, shoot this up to where it needs to be, shoot description down to where it needs to be, rice retail, and I think I'm good to go. So again, I can come in here. Oh, description should be edit multi-line. So you want that by default. You get that small little rectangle there. But, you know, just play around with it, get it to where you need to be. But now that you have those separate forms, I'm never concerned or cringe when a client comes back and say, oh, this should be named this, or this is the wrong order, or move this from this tab to this tab. Now it's like, okay, fine, bet. I can go ahead and move that, make that change, and it still becomes a 5-minute, 10-minute change versus a 2-3 hour change because I'm wrestling with ordering and controls and all this other good stuff. All right, so that's the multiple form component layout for a tabular layout. And that can be used for anything. That can be a wizard-driven form or anywhere that you need to hide and show things based on logic. I highly recommend grouping those by form controls versus trying to hide and show different data cards for a single form control. We're not done yet. In the next video, we still have to wire those up because the save piece is what's still missing. And then also, I have to come up here and decorate my colors behind my photo, my button controls and all this other good stuff, so I know I can have a visual on when status is active and not have details always show red even though it's not active. So things like that I have to come and fix. But I'm at a much better position following these 5 best practices that I learned with, you know, creating 30, 40, or 45 of these forms and running several of these through a maintenance cycle, through production and all this other good stuff, and realizing what the gotchas are. That's it for August 2019, and I'm sure by March 2020 we'll have a new set of gotchas or maybe new features and capabilities, and by this time in 2020 that whole landscape will change. That's the new world that we live in. This stuff is forever changing. And I love to shoot videos like this to kind of share my experience and my techniques just so that we continue to make this a enjoyable process. We stay focused on the innovation, and we hold up to the promise that these things can be done in a matter of minutes versus days and weeks. All right, that's it for this video. If you have any gotchas or any best practices that you have based on your experience, please share those in the comments below. Everyone in the community will be reading those comments and learning, because we're here to learn together, right? I kind of have the stage, so, but you know, we're here to learn together, and I'm willing to share. I don't want it just to be my voice, because I think we have it's a community, right? And we have so many different experiences and all this other stuff to where we can learn together. All right, check you out in the next video. Take care.